The skyscrapers of the bustling city shimmered under the golden light of the morning sun, standing as symbols of power and ambition. Within the courthouse, courtroom 12 buzzed with quiet energy. The case being heard had drawn a crowd. Curious onlookers filled the gallery, exchanging whispers about Victor Langston, a billionaire whose name had become synonymous with corruption and unchecked privilege. Judge Eleanor Hayes stood in her chambers, pulling her black robes neatly into place. Her reflection in the mirror revealed a face both commanding and compassionate. Her steady hands smoothed the fabric, though her sharp eyes betrayed the weight of the day ahead. Eleanor thought briefly of her father, a factory worker who had sacrificed so much to ensure she could study law and rise beyond their humble beginnings. This fight isn't new, she thought, but it matters as much as ever. With a steadying breath, she left her chambers and made her way to the courtroom. Victor Langston entered courtroom 12 with an air of entitlement. His designer suit clung to his broad shoulders, tailored perfectly to his towering frame. A phone pressed to his ear, he ignored the murmurs of the crowd and the raised eyebrows of his own attorney, Madeline Cross. He walked past the gallery as if he owned the place, showing no regard for the weight of the charges against him. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Hayes," the bailiff announced. Everyone in the courtroom rose to their feet, everyone except Langston. He remained seated, engrossed in his phone conversation, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Madeline shifted uncomfortably, quietly tugging at his sleeve, but Langston waved her off. Judge Hayes stepped up to the bench, her presence commanding immediate respect. Her sharp gaze swept the room, settling on Langston. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment before addressing him. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the whispers in the gallery. "Mr. Langston," she began, "in this courtroom, we observe certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters. Another is refraining from phone calls during proceedings." Langston ended his call but remained seated, leaning back in his chair with a casual smirk. "Apologies, Your Honor," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I was handling some rather important business matters." Judge Hayes's expression remained unmoved. "More important than showing respect for this court?" Langston shrugged, his smirk widening. "That depends on your perspective, doesn't it?" The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. "Let me adjust your perspective, Mr. Langston. You are facing federal charges that could put you away for 30 years. Your business matters can wait. Stand up." Langston's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. After a moment of deliberate hesitation, he rose to his feet, his arrogance still evident in his slow, measured movements. "Thank you," Judge Hayes said firmly. "You may be seated. Now let's proceed with the arraignment." As the courtroom settled, Judge Hayes remained composed, her focus shifting to the files before her. She understood the challenges ahead. This case wasn't just about a billionaire and his crimes, it was about confronting a system that allowed such arrogance to flourish. Justice, she knew, demanded patience, integrity, and strength. Today that battle would begin. As the proceedings began, the air in courtroom 12 was heavy with anticipation. Prosecutor Sophia Morales stood confidently at her table, her piercing gaze locked on Victor Langston. Months of painstaking investigation had brought them here, to a moment where justice seemed within reach. Beside her sat a meticulously organized stack of documents, each one a piece of the intricate puzzle that exposed Langston's web of deceit. Langston, however, appeared unbothered. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally whispering to his attorney, Madeline Cross, and casting smug glances toward the gallery. His confidence wasn't unfounded. 4 years, Langston's influence had penetrated every level of the city's institutions, from police departments to zoning boards. Many believed he was untouchable, a man whose money could silence any opposition. Judge Eleanor Hayes, seated at the bench, observed it all with a calm, unflinching demeanor. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of arrogance hiding fear. Langston's defiance wasn't invincibility, it was desperation disguised as confidence. The first witness was called to the stand, Margaret Ellison, a former accountant at Langston Enterprises. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she took the oath, but her voice was steady when she began her testimony. "I worked for Mr. Langston for 12 years, she stated. "I oversaw financial transactions for the company's various divisions." Sophia Morales approached her with a reassuring smile. "Ms. Ellison, can you describe the irregularities you observed during your time at Langston Enterprises?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Langston, who stared back at her with cold intensity. Judge Hayes noticed and interjected gently. "Ms. Ellison, this courtroom exists to protect the truth. Speak freely." Encouraged, Margaret continued. "It started with small discrepancies. Funds were being transferred to accounts that didn't align with our project budgets. Over time, I realized these weren't mistakes. There were dozens of offshore accounts used to hide money siphoned from company pension funds and charitable initiatives." The gallery murmured and Langston's smirk tightened. Sophia Morales presented spreadsheets and email exchanges that corroborated Margaret's claims. "These documents show that millions were funneled into shell companies under Langston Enterprises," Sophia said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "Funds meant for community development projects, senior pensions, and even children's charities. All stolen." Madeline Cross stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is making inflammatory claims without proper context." Judge Hayes nodded calmly. "Objection sustained. Counselor Morales, stick to direct questions for the witness." Sophia nodded, undeterred. "Ms. Ellison, did you confront Mr. Langston about these discrepancies?" Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "Yes. I went to him with my concerns. She paused, swallowing hard. "He told me to mind my own business and reminded me how easily he could replace me. He said, 'It's just business, Margaret. Everyone wins when I win.'" Langston's expression darkened, but he remained silent. Judge Hayes's eyes flickered toward him briefly before returning to Margaret. "Thank you, Ms. Ellison. You may step down," Judge Hayes said. During the recess, Langston's arrogance was on full display as he addressed reporters outside the courthouse. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," he declared, flashing a confident smile. "They're targeting me because I've been successful." Judge Hayes clearly has an agenda. Inside her chambers, Eleanor reviewed a note that had been slipped to her by a court officer. It was anonymous and brief. "Watch your back. Langston's reach extends further than you think." She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her drawer. Threats were nothing new to her, but this trial, with its high stakes and powerful adversary, was beginning to show the lengths Langston would go to protect himself. The afternoon session brought a pivotal turn. Sophia called Detective Marcus Bell, a whistleblower within the police department, to the stand. Bell's testimony was damning. 4 years, Langston's money has controlled key figures in the department, Bell stated. Evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant their statements, and cases against him would quietly fade away. Sophia pressed further. "And why are you speaking out now?" Bell glanced at Judge Hayes before answering. "Because I've seen too many good people silenced by fear. It's time someone stood up to him." Langston leaned over to whisper angrily to Madeline, but Judge Hayes's sharp voice cut through. "Mr. Langston, if you have something to say, direct it through your counsel. Otherwise, remain silent." Langston sat back, his frustration barely concealed. As the day's proceedings ended, Judge Hayes remained in her chambers late into the evening, reviewing case law and preparing for the days ahead. The evidence was mounting, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Langston's confidence wasn't just an act. It was backed by years of a system corrupted in his favor. She thought of the people who had been hurt, the pensioners, the children, the communities left to struggle while Langston thrived. "This isn't just about him," she murmured to herself. This is about making the system work for those who need it most. The trial was far from over, but cracks were beginning to show in Langston's empire. Justice was a long road, but Judge Hayes had walked longer, harder roads before. She wasn't about to stop now. Morning light filtered through the high windows of courtroom 12, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floors. There was an air of tension as Sophia Morales prepared to present the prosecution's most pivotal evidence. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered with her characteristic composure, the quiet authority of her presence calming the room. Victor Langston sat at the defense table, his usual confidence now tinged with a subtle tension. Beside him, Madeline Cross shuffled through a stack of legal motions, her expression betraying the pressure mounting against their case. The gallery was filled with reporters, spectators, and those whose lives Langston had irreparably damaged. They all waited, holding their breath for the next revelation. Sophia Morales began. Your Honor, members of the court, today the prosecution will demonstrate how Mr. Langston's influence extended far beyond financial crimes. What we will show is a pattern of corruption that undermined every pillar of justice. Her voice was calm, measured, but each word landed like a hammer. She introduced a digital forensic expert, Dr. Rachel Lynn, who had combed through Langston Enterprises servers. Dr. Lynn took the stand, her demeanor professional and confident. We recovered thousands of emails, financial transactions, and encrypted communications, she began. These records reveal direct instructions from Mr. Langston to facilitate bribery, suppress investigations, and intimidate witnesses. Sophia projected an email exchange onto the screen. The room grew silent as the damning words appeared in plain view. Ensure the inspector doesn't follow up on the pension audit. If necessary, remind him of the photos. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Judge Hayes's gavel struck sharply. Order in the court, she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Continue, Ms. Morales. The evidence continued to pile up. Emails and transaction records painted a detailed picture of Langston's network. Funds flowed seamlessly from Langston Enterprises into shell corporations, then into the pockets of key officials. Dr. Lynn explained the trail, step by step, making the complexity of the scheme accessible to everyone in the room. Madeline Cross stood, trying to regain control. Your Honor, I must question the chain of custody for these records. The defense has not had adequate time to verify their authenticity. Judge Hayes met her gaze steadily. Ms. Cross, the court has reviewed the evidence and found it admissible. You will have the opportunity to cross-examine the witness. Cross nodded curtly but glanced at Langston, whose jaw was visibly clenched. As the morning session drew to a close, Sophia called Detective Marcus Bell back to the stand. His earlier testimony about internal corruption within the police department had been shocking, but today he brought more. Bell detailed how key pieces of evidence against Langston had disappeared over the years, always under suspicious circumstances. One example, Bell said, was a thumb drive containing financial records tying Langston to offshore accounts. It vanished from the evidence room, and the officer responsible suddenly had a new car the next day. And who authorized that officer's access to the evidence? Sophia asked. Bell hesitated. Detective Joseph Whitman, head of the department's financial crimes unit. The name caused a ripple through the gallery. Whitman's reputation as an untouchable figure within law enforcement was well known. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression sharp. Thank you, Detective Bell, Sophia said, her tone signaling the weight of what had just been revealed. No further questions. As the court recessed for lunch, Langston's demeanor shifted. He leaned close to Madeline, speaking in a low, urgent tone. Across the room, Judge Hayes retreated to her chambers. On her desk was another anonymous note. Be careful. The closer you get, the more desperate he becomes. The afternoon session opened with a surprise witness. Margaret Ellison had returned. Your Honor, Sophia announced, the prosecution has obtained additional documents from Ms. Ellison, recovered from a secure location. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she handed over a folder. "These are copies of the ledgers I kept," she said. "I knew they'd try to destroy the original, so I made backups." Inside the folder were detailed records of transactions that connected Langston to bribery payments, intimidation tactics, and a trail of destroyed lives. Sophia presented them systematically, each page further tightening the noose around Langston's empire. Langston's calm facade finally cracked. He whispered furiously to Madeline, who raised her hand to request a brief recess. Judge Hayes denied it. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice resolute, "this court will not be delayed by theatrics. The evidence will proceed." As the session came to a close, the atmosphere was electric. Langston's empire, once impervious, was crumbling in real time. Judge Hayes, reviewing her notes in chambers that evening, knew the trial was reaching its most dangerous point. But she also knew this. The truth was emerging, and no amount of desperation could bury it now. The following morning, Courtroom 12 was charged with anticipation. The gallery was packed with journalists, onlookers, and victims eager to see justice unfold. The prosecution had promised a dramatic turn of events, and everyone was eager to witness it. Victor Langston entered the courtroom flanked by his legal team, his expression unreadable. His once confident swagger had been replaced with a forced calm. Madeline Cross, his defense attorney, seemed unusually reserved, her eyes darting between the judge's bench and the prosecution's table. Judge Eleanor Hayes presided with her usual steady demeanor, but beneath her composed exterior, she remained acutely aware of the stakes. Each piece of evidence revealed so far painted a damning picture of Langston's corruption, but she knew the trial's final acts would determine whether justice could truly prevail. Prosecutor Sophia Morales stood to address the court. "Your Honor, today the prosecution will present evidence that demonstrates not only the depth of Mr. Langston's corruption but the violent lengths to which he went to silence opposition." Gasps rippled through the gallery as Sophia called her next witness, Officer Michael Sullivan, a young officer who had worked under Detective Joseph Whitman. Sullivan stepped forward, his nerves evident but his resolve unshaken. "Officer Sullivan," Sophia began, "can you describe your role in handling evidence related to Mr. Langston's activities?" Sullivan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was assigned to the evidence room on multiple occasions. During that time, I witnessed Detective Whitman tampering with key evidence in cases involving Mr. Langston. Files would disappear, evidence would be mislabeled, and occasionally items would be outright destroyed. Why did you choose to come forward now?" Sophia asked. Sullivan glanced briefly at Langston before answering. "Because I couldn't keep quiet anymore. People are suffering because of this corruption, and it's time someone stood up." Langston's jaw tightened as whispers filled the courtroom. Judge Hayes struck her gavel. "Order in the court. Officer Sullivan, you may continue." Sullivan took a deep breath and recounted a chilling event. "One night, I overheard a conversation between Detective Whitman and one of Langston's associates. They were discussing plans to intimidate a witness. Whitman was instructed to make it look like an accident if the witness didn't back down." The room fell into stunned silence. Sophia Morales presented corroborating evidence. A recorded phone call between Whitman and Langston's team discussing the same witness. Madeline Cross stood to object. "Your Honor, this recording is circumstantial at best. There is no direct evidence tying my client to these alleged actions." Judge Hayes's gaze was firm. "The court will allow the evidence. The defense may cross-examine Officer Sullivan after the prosecution concludes." Sophia introduced her final piece of evidence for the day, a thumb drive recovered from Langston's private office. "Your Honor, this drive contains surveillance footage from Langston Enterprises," Sophia explained. "It captures meetings where bribes were arranged and instructions were given to tamper with investigations." The footage played on the screen. It showed Langston speaking with several key officials, including Detective Whitman. Langston's voice rang through the courtroom, I don't care what it costs. Make sure this goes away. I pay you people for results, not excuses. The gallery erupted. Judge Hayes struck her gavel sharply. Order, she demanded. We will have decorum in this courtroom. Langston's mask of control slipped for the first time. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Madeline Cross leaned in to whisper urgently, but he waved her off. As the court adjourned for the day, Judge Hayes retreated to her chambers. A note awaited her on her desk, its words brief but chilling. You're digging too deep. Stop now or you'll regret it. Eleanor stared at the note for a long moment before locking it in her drawer. She had faced threats before, but this trial felt different. The corruption they were exposing ran deeper than she had anticipated, and the closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it became. That evening, Sophia Morales met with Officer Sullivan and other key witnesses to ensure their safety. Federal protection had been arranged, but the fear in their eyes was evident. We'll get through this, Sophia assured them. Your courage is what will bring justice. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Victor Langston paced his office, barking orders into his phone. Find out who's leaking this information, he snarled. I don't care what it takes, shut them down. But cracks were beginning to show in Langston's empire. His usual allies were growing wary, and whispers of betrayal circled closer with each passing day. Judge Hayes sat by her desk late into the night, reviewing the day's evidence. The fight was far from over, but she felt a growing resolve. Justice was within reach and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The courtroom was electric with tension as the trial neared its conclusion. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered with her usual measured steps, her presence commanding immediate silence. The weight of the proceedings pressed heavily on everyone present, and today promised to be a turning point in the pursuit of justice. Victor Langston's defense team had been relentless, filing motion after motion to discredit the prosecution's evidence and witnesses. Madeline Cross, ever poised, had pushed every legal boundary in an effort to delay the inevitable. But now, cracks were forming in Langston's carefully constructed empire of lies and influence. The prosecution, led by Sophia Morales, was ready for the final push. Today's proceedings would focus on a star witness who had come forward with damning testimony against Langston. Federal agents escorted Thomas Bradford, a former financial officer at Langston Enterprises, into the courtroom. His appearance drew a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Many knew he had been missing for months, reportedly under heavy intimidation. Sophia began her examination with a tone of assurance. Mr. Bradford, can you describe your role at Langston Enterprises? Bradford adjusted his tie nervously but spoke clearly. I was the chief financial officer for over 10 years. My job was to oversee all financial operations from payroll to investments. But over time, it became clear that my real role was to cover up illicit activities. Langston's face remained impassive, but his clenched fists betrayed his tension. Sophia pressed on. What specific activities are you referring to? Bradford hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing the risks. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her calm voice breaking the silence. Mr. Bradford, you are under federal protection. Speak freely. Drawing a deep breath, Bradford continued. Langston used shell companies to funnel millions of dollars into offshore accounts. These funds came from pensions, community development projects, and even donations to charitable organizations. I created the documents to make it all look legitimate. Gasps erupted in the gallery, and Judge Hayes struck her gavel sharply. Order, she commanded. Proceed, Counselor Morales. Sophia displayed copies of falsified documents on the courtroom screens. Are these the records you manipulated under Mr. Langston's orders? Bradford nodded. Yes. These records show how money was moved through multiple accounts to obscure its origins. The aim was always the same, to ensure no one could trace the funds back to Langston Enterprises. Madeline Cross rose. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is highly prejudicial and lacks corroboration. Judge Hayes's gaze was firm. Overruled. The documents have been authenticated, and the witness's testimony is directly relevant. Continue, Ms. Morales. Sophia stepped closer to the witness stand. Mr. Bradford, did you ever express concerns about these activities? Yes, he replied. But every time I brought it up, I was reminded of what happened to others who crossed Langston. People were fired, blackmailed, or worse. I stayed quiet because I was afraid for my family. At this, Langston leaned forward, whispering to Madeline. Judge Hayes noticed but did not react. Sophia turned back to the jury. Your Honor, members of the jury, she said, this testimony is more than just a confession. It's a window into the systematic destruction Langston orchestrated for profit. As the day continued, Sophia introduced another surprise, a video recording of Langston meeting with Detective Joseph Whitman. In the footage, Langston's voice was cold and calculating. I don't care what it takes, he said. Make sure those witnesses disappear or make it look like they're lying. Either way, I want this trial buried. Langston's composure finally cracked. He slammed his fist on the defense table. This is a setup, he shouted. None of this proves anything. Judge Hayes struck her gavel. Mr. Langston, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear? Langston sank back into his chair, his face dark with anger. The gallery was buzzing, but Hayes's gavel restored order once again. As the court adjourned for the day, the tension in the air was palpable. Langston's world was unraveling and everyone could feel it. Outside the courthouse, protesters called for justice, their chants echoing through the streets. Judge Hayes returned to her chambers, exhausted but resolute. Another anonymous note awaited her. You're getting closer. But be careful. Desperate men are the most dangerous. She folded the note and placed it in her drawer, her mind turning over the events of the day. Justice was within reach, but the road to get there was fraught with peril. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Judge Hayes was ready. This was the fight of her career and she would not falter. The courtroom was abuzz the following morning, the air heavy with anticipation. The trial had reached its climax, and all eyes were on Judge Eleanor Hayes as she entered and took her seat. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and the overflow of spectators lined the hallways, eager to witness the outcome of what had become the most significant corruption case in decades. Victor Langston sat at the defense table, visibly strained but still attempting to project an air of defiance. His attorney, Madeline Cross, whispered hurriedly to him, but her tone lacked the confidence she had carried earlier in the trial. The evidence presented over the past weeks had taken a toll, and even Langston's staunchest supporters had begun to waver. Sophia Morales stood ready, her notes meticulously organized. Today she would deliver the final blows to Langston's crumbling facade. Your Honor, Sophia began, her voice steady and resolute, the prosecution calls Officer Michael Sullivan back to the stand. Sullivan, the young whistleblower, returned to the witness box. Despite the clear danger he faced, he sat with his back straight, his resolve unwavering. Officer Sullivan, Sophia began, you testified earlier about evidence tampering within the department. Can you elaborate on the extent of Detective Whitman's involvement? Sullivan nodded. Whitman wasn't just tampering with evidence. He was actively orchestrating the destruction of critical files and intimidating witnesses on Langston's behalf. He received direct payments through offshore accounts, which we uncovered during the investigation. And how were you able to verify these payments? Sophia asked. The financial records recovered from Langston Enterprises included detailed transaction logs. I also witnessed Whitman withdrawing large sums of cash after receiving instructions from Langston. Sophia displayed a series of bank statements and surveillance images on the courtroom screen. Each document painted an unassailable picture of corruption, tying Langston directly to Whitman's illegal activities. Madeline Cross rose, her voice sharp. Objection, Your Honor. This is prejudicial and lacks corroboration from an independent source. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. Ms. Cross, the evidence has been authenticated and corroborated through multiple witnesses. Objection overruled. Proceed, Ms. Morales. Sophia turned back to Sullivan. Officer Sullivan, was there a turning point that led you to come forward? Sullivan's expression darkened. Yes. It was when I learned about the threats against Thomas Bradford and his family. Whitman had ordered officers to follow his children to school as a warning. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. The gallery erupted into murmurs and Judge Hayes struck her gavel. Order. Langston's face turned an alarming shade of red as he leaned toward Madeline, hissing something inaudible. Sophia let the moment hang before continuing. Thank you, Officer Sullivan. No further questions. As Sullivan stepped down, Sophia called her final witness, Claire Donovan, Langston's former personal assistant. Claire had been a surprising addition to the prosecution's case, and her testimony was expected to be explosive. Ms. Donovan, Sophia began, you worked closely with Mr. Langston for over a decade. Can you describe his methods of maintaining control over his associates? Claire's voice was steady but laced with emotion. He used a combination of bribes, blackmail, and fear. Everyone in his orbit was either paid off or coerced into silence. If anyone tried to resist, he made examples of them. Can you give the court an example? Sophia asked. Claire hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. Judge Hayes offered a nod of encouragement and Claire continued. There was a journalist, Michael Foster. He was investigating Langston's offshore accounts. One night he was attacked outside his home. Langston called it a warning shot. The gallery gasped and Langston's composure finally cracked. She's lying, he shouted, standing abruptly. Judge Hayes struck her gavel with force. Mr. Langston, one more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom. Sit down. Langston reluctantly obeyed, his face a mask of fury. Sophia presented Claire's handwritten notes and internal emails documenting Langston's orders. Ms. Donovan, why did you decide to come forward? Claire's eyes met Langston's with unflinching determination. Because I couldn't live with myself knowing what he'd done. People deserve to know the truth. The prosecution rested its case, and Judge Hayes called for closing arguments. Sophia Morales delivered a powerful summation, her voice filled with conviction. Members of the jury, this trial has revealed the true character of Victor Langston. He is a man who believed himself untouchable, willing to destroy lives for his own gain. But today you have the power to prove that no one is above the law. I urge you to deliver a verdict that reflects the truth. Madeline Cross's closing argument was measured but lacked the fire of her earlier defenses. The evidence against Langston had become insurmountable, and it was clear she was preparing for damage control rather than victory. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Hayes addressed the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charges of corruption, bribery, and witness intimidation, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted into cheers and sobs of relief. Langston slumped in his seat, his defiance finally extinguished. Judge Hayes restored order and addressed the defendant. Victor Langston, your actions have caused untold harm to countless individuals and institutions. This court will ensure that justice is served. Sentencing will be scheduled in 1 month. As Langston was led away in handcuffs, Sophia Morales shared a quiet moment with Claire Donovan and Officer Sullivan. You did it, Sophia said softly. You stood up to him and now the truth is out. Judge Hayes returned to her chambers, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. Another note awaited her. Justice won today. But the fight isn't over. She placed the note in her drawer and allowed herself a rare smile. The trial had ended, but the work to rebuild faith in the system was just beginning. In the weeks following the verdict, the ripple effects of the trial were felt across the city. Federal investigations uncovered further corruption, leading to arrests of officials who had long operated with impunity. Community leaders began rebuilding programs that Langston had dismantled, and whistleblowers were finally being heard. Judge Hayes was invited to speak at law schools and public forums, her steadfast commitment to justice becoming a symbol of hope. Sophia Morales's career flourished, and she continued to fight for those who had been silenced for too long. As for Victor Langston, his empire lay in ruins. From his prison cell, he could only watch as the world moved on without him, his name now synonymous with greed and betrayal. The case had ended, but its legacy endured. It had shown that justice, though often delayed, could prevail when brave individuals stood together against corruption. And in Courtroom 12, beneath the scales of justice, a new chapter of accountability began. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters.